I remember that detail clearly. The way the lights blinked on and off in that slow, lazy pattern my son had set before dinner, the tinsel catching the glow from the fireplace. My daughter-in-law Renee had spent 3 days decorating that tree. She had made a point of telling me that. 3 days. She wanted me to understand how much effort went into things I apparently didn't appreciate enough. I was 63 years old, sitting at the head of a table I had paid for, in a house I had co-signed on, eating a Christmas dinner that my son Marcus had heated up from a tray because Renee didn't feel like cooking this year. The green beans were soft in a way that suggested they had been sitting in a warming drawer for too long. The turkey was fine. The wine was one I had brought, a bottle I'd been holding on to for a few years. The kind you save for something worth celebrating. I wasn't sure what I thought I was celebrating. Marcus is 41. He has his mother's eyes, light brown, almost amber in certain light, and my stubbornness, which I say without pride. He works in commercial insurance, does well enough, always has. Renee teaches part-time at a community college, English composition, though she's mentioned several times that she's overqualified for it. They have 2 kids, Jalen, who is 9, and a daughter, Piper, who just turned 6. Both of them were upstairs that night when it happened, and I'm glad for that. Some things children shouldn't witness. My wife, Sandra, passed 11 years ago. Breast cancer. Caught late. I won't spend much time on that because the story isn't about her death. It's about what I built in the years after it. How I held things together. How I showed up, over and over. Because that's what you do when you're a father, and the scaffolding of your family has just collapsed, and everyone is looking at you to figure out if the whole structure is going to fall. It didn't fall. I made sure of that after Sandra died. Marcus was 30, newly married, and struggling. He and Renee had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus with a lease that was ending in 3 months and no clear plan for what came next. I was still working then. I'd spent 28 years in civil engineering, mostly municipal infrastructure projects, bridges and drainage systems, and the unglamorous work that keeps a city functioning. I had savings. I had a pension that was going to be solid. I had a house that was too big and too quiet, and that I didn't particularly want to rattle around in alone. So I helped. I don't say that looking for credit. I say it because it's the context for everything else. I co-signed on a mortgage for a house in Westerville, a 4-bedroom colonial with a yard big enough for the kids they were planning to have, a 2-car garage, a finished basement Marcus wanted for his home office. The price was $387,000. My name was on the loan, because Marcus's credit wasn't where it needed to be yet, and Renee had a gap in her employment history from a year she'd taken off for reasons I was never fully told. The bank needed my signature to make the numbers work. I gave it without hesitating. Over the next 9 years, I helped with property taxes twice when they had a lien year. I paid for a new HVAC system when the old one died in August. I watched Jalen and Piper every Friday so Renee could take an evening class, and every other Saturday so Marcus could play in a recreational basketball league he cared about more than he'd admit. I drove 3 hours round trip for Piper's birthday party last April, because Renee had wanted it at a specific venue in Dublin and needed an extra set of hands with the younger kids. I was there. That is the simple version of 9 years. The longer version involves a lot of dinners where I sat at that table and listened to conversations I was adjacent to, but not really part of. A lot of moments where Renee would say something, not quite rude, never quite rude, always something you'd feel foolish calling out, that left me feeling like a guest who had overstayed. Marcus would go quiet in those moments. He developed a habit of studying his phone when the air in a room got tense. I told myself it was just their dynamic. I told myself I wasn't being pushed out, I was just being managed. The Friday before Christmas, I had driven up to spend the holiday week with them. I do this every year, or I had for the past 9 years. I sleep in the guest room, which used to be warm and smelled like the cedar sachets Sandra always kept in closets, but which Renee had eventually redecorated into something that felt like a mid-range hotel room. Beige walls, a duvet with no character, a nightstand with nothing on it. Clean, efficient, unwelcoming in a way I couldn't articulate. Christmas Eve dinner was the tray meal. We sat down, poured the wine I'd brought, and for a while it was fine. Jalen told me about a science project. Piper showed me a drawing she'd made of a horse. Marcus and I talked about a game that had been on earlier in the week. Renee was quiet in the particular way she gets quiet when she is not happy about something and is waiting for someone to notice. I should have left then. I know that now. I should have read the room and said I was tired and gone upstairs and in the morning found some reason to drive home early. But I didn't. I sat there with my glass of wine and my soft green beans and I thought, this is my son's house. My grandchildren are upstairs. It's Christmas Eve. Whatever is bothering Renee will pass. It didn't pass. After the kids went up to bed, Marcus poured himself another glass and sat back in his chair with that particular stillness he gets when he's preparing himself for something. Renee began clearing plates with a precision that meant she wasn't actually cleaning up. She was organizing herself. Her movements were too deliberate. "We need to talk about something," Marcus said. I set down my glass. What followed was something they had clearly discussed beforehand, maybe many times. The words had the rehearsed quality of a conversation that had been practiced in the car, or in hushed tones after the kids were asleep, or in the kind of texts people send each other when they are in the same house and don't want to be overheard. Marcus spoke first. Or, he tried to. He said something about how they'd been thinking about the arrangement, about the house, about wanting to feel more independent. He used the word boundaries twice in the first 3 sentences. I listened. Then Renee spoke, and she was less careful. She said they wanted to refinance the mortgage. Get my name off the loan. They had talked to a lender and qualified on their own now. Their credit and income were fine. They didn't need my signature anymore. That part was reasonable. I had no objection to that. Then she said they'd been feeling like my visits were too frequent, that they needed their home to feel like their home, not an extension of my retirement. She said Jalen and Piper needed to have a relationship with me that was more age-appropriate, whatever that meant. She said she and Marcus needed room to make their own decisions without feeling like there was someone watching. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table. "Is this what you want?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. That pause, I won't forget it. The Christmas lights were still blinking on and off behind him, red and green and gold, and the fire had died down to coals, and my son sat in the chair at his own table and could not look at me. "We think it's for the best," he said. "All of us." Renee said, "Honestly, Dad, and I mean this with love, the best Christmas gift you could give us would be to step back. Give us space. You being so present all the time is part of the problem." I sat with that for a moment. The best Christmas gift. Step back. The problem. I am not a man who raises his voice. Sandra used to say that was one of my better qualities, and one of my worst ones, that I go quiet when I'm hurt, that I process inward, that I can sit with something painful and not make a scene. She said sometimes people need you to make a scene so they understand they've gone too far. She was right about that. I did not make a scene. I said, "All right, I hear you." I folded my napkin. I said good night. I went upstairs to the beige room with the beige duvet, and I lay on top of the covers without turning the lights off, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about Sandra, about what she would have made of all this. I thought about the bridge project I'd spent 4 years on in the late 90s, this pedestrian overpass that had been underfunded twice, pushed back twice, and that I had kept alive through 2 changes in city administration through sheer persistence. It opened in 2001, and there's a plaque on it now that most people walk past without reading. I thought about that plaque for some reason. About how you can spend years holding something up and no one really knows the weight of it until it's gone. I didn't sleep. At some point, the lights outside changed from the deep black of late night to the gray-blue of very early morning, and I could hear Piper moving around down the hall. She always woke up early on Christmas. And I lay there, and I made a decision. It wasn't made in anger. I want to be clear about that. Some of the best and most lasting decisions of my life have come from that particular type of cold, quiet clarity that only arrives after a long night and a genuine reckoning. I'd made the decision to marry Sandra in that kind of clarity. I'd made the decision to stay in Columbus after she died. When my brother in Tucson wanted me to come live near him, in that kind of clarity. Those decisions were right. I trusted the feeling. The decision I made that morning was this. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I got up, I showered, I dressed. I came downstairs before Marcus and Renee were awake, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, and I wrote out what I was going to do in the same methodical way I'd worked through engineering problems for 30 years, step by step, variable by variable. By the time Marcus came downstairs at 8:30, I had most of it figured out. We exchanged Merry Christmases. He poured himself coffee. He seemed relieved that I wasn't acting differently, which told me he'd been dreading the morning. The kids came down, and there were gifts and the chaos of wrapping paper, and Jalen's delight over some video game, and Piper's attachment to a stuffed animal she named immediately. I sat on the couch and watched all of it, and I smiled when I was supposed to smile, and I held Piper when she climbed into my lap, which she still does, small and warm, smelling like sleep and strawberry shampoo. That part was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. I left after lunch. I said I was tired from the drive, that I wanted to sleep in my own bed. Renee hugged me. She hugged me, which still strikes me as something, and Marcus walked me to my car. He said he hoped I understood that it wasn't personal. I told him I understood. He said he'd call in a few days. I told him I'd be around. I drove home to my house in Lancaster. It takes about 40 minutes. I didn't turn the radio on. In January, I called my attorney. I had used him for Sandra's estate and for some real estate work years ago, and I trusted him. I told him what I wanted to do. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've thought this through." "I have," I said. "Give me 2 weeks." What I had asked him to do was this. I wanted to formally separate every financial entanglement I had with Marcus and Renee. The mortgage cosign was the most significant. Marcus had already said they were refinancing, so that would resolve itself. I just wanted to be notified when my name was off the loan in writing, with documentation. Beyond that, I had been named in their homeowner's insurance policy in some secondary capacity from years ago that I'd honestly forgotten about until I went through my files that December night. I wanted off that too. I had also, at some point, added Marcus as a beneficiary on a secondary savings account that I had been quietly contributing to for years, money I had set aside thinking of it loosely as something I'd eventually give him, for college funds, for the grandkids, for whatever. That account held $61,000. I moved it. I didn't take it away from the grandkids. I opened a custodial account in Jalen's name and one in Piper's name, with conditions. Accessible for education, health, or after they turned 25, but not passable through their parents. I was named the administrator. If something happened to me, my attorney was designated successor. Marcus and Renee would not have access. I also called the real estate agent I had used twice in my career, a woman named Bet who is sharp and doesn't waste words, and I told her I was interested in downsizing. My house in Lancaster is a 4-bedroom that I had lived in for 22 years. The house Marcus grew up in, the house where Sandra kept her garden, and where I had painted every room at least twice. I had been holding on to it, partly out of habit, and partly because I wasn't sure what came next. I now had a better idea of what came next. Bet listed it in February. It sold in 19 days for $334,000, which was more than I had expected, and which felt, in some private way, like the universe making a small concession to fairness. I had already found a condominium in Asheville, North Carolina, 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, a balcony facing west, in a building with a pool and a fitness room and a walkable downtown that I had visited once years ago with Sandra and always thought we'd come back to someday. The price was manageable. The HOA fees were reasonable. The neighbor on my right, I would learn later, is a retired cardiologist named Ed who plays acoustic guitar badly and enthusiastically, and who turned out to be one of the funnier people I've met in years. I arranged a forwarding address. I updated my accounts. I scheduled the movers. I did all of this without telling Marcus. I know how that reads. I've sat with it. But here is what I kept returning to. They had made a decision about their family, their boundaries, their needs, without consulting me. They had rehearsed it, refined it, and delivered it over a Christmas dinner that I had brought the wine for. They didn't ask what I thought. They told me what was going to happen. They gave me the verdict and handed me a role in a story they'd already written. I was simply writing my own. I told Marcus I was moving in March, about 3 weeks before it happened. I called him on a Sunday evening. I told him I decided to sell the Lancaster house, that I was relocating to Asheville, that I had put a deposit on a condo. I kept my voice level. I told him the move date. I told him I'd left a letter for him at the house. He still had a key. He could come get it any time before the movers arrived. He was quiet for a long time. Asheville, he said. Yes. That's 8 hours away. About 7.5, I said. Another silence. Dad, is this because of what we said at Christmas? I thought about how to answer that honestly. It's because of what I heard at Christmas, I said. There's a difference. He came to the house the following Saturday, alone. Renee didn't come. He walked through the rooms the way you walk through a place you know is disappearing, slowly, touching door frames, looking at things that had always been there and that he'd long since stopped seeing. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table he'd done homework at, that Sandra had made him eat breakfast at before school even when he was a teenager and resistant to mornings. And he read the letter while I sat across from him. I had written it over several evenings. It wasn't long. It wasn't angry. I had told him, plainly, the things I had done over the years, not to demand credit, but because I thought he deserved to have the full inventory. Clearly stated, without the softening effect of time. I told him what the mortgage cosign had meant for my own credit. The years I'd kept that potential liability on my record. The ways it had affected financial decisions I'd made or not made. I told him about the HVAC, the tax payments, the Fridays, the Saturdays, the 3-hour round trips, and then I told him what I was leaving him, not the $61,000 that belonged to his children and would reach them in time. What I was leaving him was the thing he'd asked for, space, independence. The experience of his family being his own, unobserved, not beholden, not indebted. I told him I genuinely hoped it would be good for all of them. I was not being sarcastic. I meant it. I told him I loved him. I told him that would not change. I told him Piper and Jalen had accounts in their names, and that I had written letters to each of them, sealed, to be given to them when they were old enough to understand, that I intended to be present in my grandchildren's lives in whatever way made sense, and that I hoped, in time, he and I would find a version of a relationship that didn't require me to make myself smaller to fit into. He sat there for a long time after he finished reading. His coffee went cold. Outside, the February light was thin and gray, coming in flat to the kitchen window the way it does in Ohio in winter, illuminating nothing warmly. I didn't mean for it to go like this, he said. I know, I said. Renee, she feels like you've never really accepted her, like you judge her. I considered that. I probably haven't always made her feel welcome, I said. That's fair. I don't think I judged her so much as I watched her. And I watched her treat you in ways I found hard to see. But that's your marriage. You're right that it's not my place. He looked up at me. You're not angry, he said. It wasn't a question. It seemed to confuse him. I was, I said, for about a week. Then I got tired of being angry at you and I started making plans instead. He almost smiled at that. A flicker of something. Recognition, maybe. He's heard me say versions of that before. When a project falls apart, you don't sit in the rubble. You survey the damage, you update your drawings, you build differently the second time. We hugged in the driveway when he left. He held on longer than usual. I patted his back twice, the way I always have since he was a boy. I watched him drive down the street until he turned the corner and disappeared. I stood there for a moment in the cold. Then I went back inside to finish packing. The movers came on a Tuesday. watching them disassemble 30 years of accumulated life. The bookshelves, the armchairs, the dining set Sandra and I had bought at an estate sale in 1993 and refinished together in the garage over a long weekend, was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Not sad, exactly. Or not only sad, there was also something clarifying about it. You see what you actually need when you're deciding what to put in the truck. Most of what I owned, it turned out, I didn't need. I drove down separately, following the truck. 13 hours with one stop, through West Virginia and into North Carolina, the landscape changing from the flat gray of midwinter Ohio to something greener and more vertical. The mountains emerged in the late afternoon, still carrying snow on the upper ridges. And I remember thinking Sandra would have wanted to stop every 20 minutes to take pictures. The condo was bright. That surprised me. I had bought it in winter based on photographs and one afternoon visit, and I had braced for disappointment, the way a place sometimes collapses from the version in your mind to the version in reality. But the light came in from the west, and it was warmer than I expected, and the space felt like a beginning rather than a reduction. Ed from next door knocked on my door that first evening with a bottle of bourbon and the information that the building's Wi-Fi password was taped inside the utility closet and that the pizza place on the corner was better than it looked. He stayed for 2 hours. I didn't mind. That was 8 months ago. I have not had a single Friday where I felt like a guest in a room not designed for me. I've been to a concert in the park and a brewery that a colleague of Ed's recommended and a farmer's market that I now go to most Saturday mornings. I've started a project I've thought about for years. A kind of personal history of the infrastructure work I did over 3 decades, written down, not for publication, just for myself, just to have a record. I write it in the mornings with coffee on the balcony when the weather allows. Marcus and I have talked on the phone carefully a few times. The conversations are shorter than they used to be and more honest, which I count as progress. He told me that Renee had been surprised by my move. I told him she shouldn't have been. He asked if I was happy. I thought about that question for a moment before I answered, not because the answer was complicated, but because I wanted to answer it accurately. I'm lighter, I said. That's the truest version of it. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad, he said, and I think he meant it. Piper sent me a drawing in the mail a few weeks ago. She'd done it herself, sealed it in an envelope, and apparently dictated the address to Jalen, who had looked it up. It was a drawing of a man on a balcony, and below the balcony there were mountains, and in the corner there was a sun with a face, and at the bottom in careful 6-year-old handwriting it said, "I miss you, Grandpa." Do the mountains have snow? I put it on the refrigerator. I wrote her back and told her yes, some of them do. I told her that when she visits, we can find a place to see the snow up close if she wants. I told her I'd been saving a story about mountains for when she was old enough to sit still long enough to hear it. I told her I loved her. I sent the letter with a self-addressed stamped envelope inside so she could write back without needing help. 3 days later, something arrived in the mail. The envelope was crooked, and the stamp was placed with great conviction in the center of the upper right corner, slightly too high. Inside was a drawing of what I believe was a horse, and the words, "Yes, please, come get me. I want to see snow." I laughed. Actually laughed, alone in my kitchen at 7:30 in the morning, with my coffee and my project notes and the western light coming in low and gold. There are things I gave up. I know that. There are Friday evenings I won't get back, school plays I may not be in the front row for, dinners that will happen without me. I give up the particular comfort of proximity, the ability to drive 40 minutes and be present for the small, ordinary moments that accumulate over years into the feeling of being known. But I have also, and this is the thing I could not have told you in December, standing in that driveway in the Ohio cold, I have also stopped bleeding. I didn't realize, until I stopped, how much I had been giving in ways that were never going to fill anything. How much I had been making myself small and available and accommodating in hopes that the love I'd invested would eventually be returned in kind. I had been circling a table that didn't have a seat for me and telling myself I just needed to wait a little longer. I was 63 years old. I had things I wanted to do. I will tell you what I've learned, if you want it. For whatever it's worth, coming from a retired engineer who grew up in Ohio and now lives on a second-floor balcony in the Appalachian foothills, the people who truly want you in their lives will make room for you. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but they will make room. When someone shows you, clearly and repeatedly, that your presence is a burden to them, you are not helping anyone by staying. Not them, not yourself. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to take the parts of your life that still have years in them and go somewhere that can be used well. You are allowed to build something new at 63, or 65, or 70, if that's when the moment comes. The age is not the thing. The decision is the thing. My father used to say that a man's life is not measured by what he endures, but by what he builds. He was a stoic man, not given to speeches, and he said that to me exactly once when I was 26 and going through something I thought was the end of the world, and that I can barely remember now. I've thought about it a lot in the last 8 months. I've built bridges, actual ones. Structures that carry weight, that were designed with failure points in mind, that were meant to last longer than the people who designed them. I know how to calculate load. I know what happens when a structure is asked to bear more than it was designed for. I also know that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is put down what you've been carrying. The mountains outside my window have snow on them this morning. Not much. It's early in the season, just a dusting on the upper elevations, visible at certain angles of light. I'm going to make another cup of coffee and sit on the balcony and look at the mountains. And then I'm going to write back to my granddaughter about snow. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since I moved to Asheville. That's what happens when you trade a house full of other people's noise for a quiet balcony and a view of mountains that don't ask anything of you. You start to see things more clearly than you could when you were in the middle of them. What I've come to understand is this. The way things ended between me and Marcus didn't happen because of one Christmas Eve dinner. It happened because of 100 smaller moments I chose not to name. Every time I absorbed a slight without saying anything, every time I made myself smaller to keep the peace, every time I handed over time or money or presents and told myself it didn't need to be acknowledged, I was teaching the people around me what I was worth. Not intentionally, but that's how it works. People learn how to treat you from how you let them treat you, and I had been a patient and accommodating teacher for a very long time. Renee didn't wake up one morning and decide to be unkind to me. I think she's a woman who wants control of her home and her family, and she looked at me in this constant, available, always there presence, and saw something that complicated that control. I'm not excusing what she said, but I understand it better now than I did sitting at that table in December. Understanding it doesn't mean accepting it. Those are two different things, and knowing the difference is something I had to learn the hard way. Marcus is my son, and I love him without condition. But love without honesty isn't really love. It's just comfort, dressed up. I spent years being comfortable around Marcus in ways that let us both avoid the truth of what was happening. The move, the letter, the phone call where I told him plainly what I had decided, those were the most honest things I'd done in our relationship in years. And honesty, even when it's hard, is the only material strong enough to build something real on. I know that from engineering. I know it from marriage. I know it now from this too. What I want to say to anyone who finds themselves in a version of what I went through is this. The moment you realize you've been carrying more than your share is not the moment to negotiate. It's the moment to put it down. Not out of bitterness. Not to punish anyone, just because you finally understood that you cannot pour endlessly from something that is never refilled, and that choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning the people you love. Piper's drawing is still on my refrigerator. Jalen has started texting me actual texts, short and misspelled and funny, the way 9-year-olds communicate. Marcus and I talk on Sundays now, carefully but honestly. Things are not repaired, but they are repairing, slowly, the way things do when they're allowed to be true, instead of just agreeable. I'm 63 years old. I have mountains outside my window. I have a neighbor who plays guitar badly with great enthusiasm. I have a project I've wanted to write for 20 years, and I write it every morning. I didn't lose my family when I left. I stopped losing myself. That's the thing nobody tells you about walking away. It isn't an ending. It's just finally, after all that time, deciding to begin.